Before Caesar, before Augustus, before Rome was Rome, there were kings, and three of those kings weren't even Roman. They came from a civilization that no longer exists, a people so thoroughly written out of history that even their language still hasn't been fully decoded. And yet without them, the city that would one day conquer the world might have remained nothing more than a muddy collection of hilltop villages. This is the story the Romans buried, the kings they wanted to forget, and why that forgetting tells us more about Rome than almost anything else. When most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture marble columns, legions on the march, emperors commanding millions. But strip all of that away. Go back far enough, and what you actually find is a cluster of mud huts on a river. That's it. Around the 8th century BC, small communities were scattered across a series of hills overlooking the Tiber River, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal. The people living there were farmers, herders, and small-time traders. The Tiber gave them access to trade. The hills gave them something to hide behind when enemies came. It was a decent location, but it was nothing special. Roman tradition says the city was founded in 753 BC by a man named Romulus, who, according to legend, killed his own twin brother to become its first king. Whether Romulus actually existed is another question entirely. But archaeology does confirm that real communities were taking shape here around that time. The problem was this: Rome wasn't alone. To the south, Greek colonists had already built prosperous, sophisticated cities along the Italian coast, and to the north, far more powerful, far more relevant to Rome's immediate future, was a civilization that most people today have barely heard of: the Etruscans. Even at a glance, the contrast was stark. While early Romans were still sleeping in wattle and daub huts, the Etruscans were building cities with stone temples, underground tombs painted in vivid color, and trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean. Cities like Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, and Clusium were prosperous, organized, and ambitious. Greek merchants visited their ports, luxury goods flowed through their markets. Their noble families displayed a level of wealth that the average Roman at this time couldn't have imagined. These were not primitive neighbors. These were the dominant civilization of central Italy, and early Rome sat squarely in their shadow. As the 7th century BC wound down, the two worlds began to collide. Trade routes crossed, ideas traveled, cultural influences blurred, and eventually, according to Roman tradition, an ambitious man from Etruria decided to make his fortune in this scrappy little river town. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and Rome would never be the same. Tarquinius was not born into power. That in itself made him dangerous. According to Roman tradition, he came from Tarquinii, one of the wealthiest cities in Etruria. His family had money, his family had connections, but Tarquinius himself faced a ceiling. His father, the stories say, was a Greek immigrant. In the rigid social world of the Etruscans, that made Tarquinius something of an outsider, too foreign to climb as high as his ambitions demanded. So he looked south. His wife, Tanaquil, may have been the one who pushed him to go. Roman writers remembered her as shrewd, politically calculating, and deeply skilled in the reading of omens, a practice the Etruscans had essentially turned into a science. She believed her husband was destined for something greater than what Etruria would give him. She wanted him to have it. The story of how they arrived in Rome reads almost like a scene from a film. As the couple traveled south toward the city, an eagle, out of nowhere, swooped down, snatched the cap from Tarquinius's head, soared high into the sky, and then, just as suddenly, returned and placed it back on his head before vanishing. Tanaquil didn't hesitate. To her, this was not a random event. It was a message. The eagle, bird of the gods, had singled out her husband. Great things were coming. We can't know if the story is true, but it tells us something important. The Etruscans took omens seriously. They had an entire system of priests, texts, and rituals dedicated to reading divine will through natural signs, through lightning, through the behavior of birds, through the organs of sacrificed animals. The Romans, who would later absorb enormous amounts of Etruscan religious practice, eventually took it just as seriously. When Tarquinius arrived in Rome, he came bearing exactly what the city's ambitious residents found hard to resist: wealth, charisma, and Etruscan sophistication. He attached himself to the reigning king, Ancus Marcius, and rose steadily as one of the king's most trusted advisors. When Ancus Marcius died, Tarquinius moved fast. While the late king's sons were still organizing their succession, he went directly to the Roman people, made his case, and was elected king. Around 616 BC, for the first time, an Etruscan sat on the Roman throne. A man who had to fight his way to power doesn't rest once he gets there. He builds. Tarquinius Priscus arrived in Rome with a vision, not just of what the city was, but of what it could become, and he set about making that vision real. His military campaigns pushed Roman influence into the Latin and Sabine territories surrounding the city. Victories brought back not just plunder, but prestige. Rome was establishing itself as a force to be taken seriously, but the most consequential thing Tarquinius did wasn't done with a sword. Here was the problem every Roman king before him had quietly ignored. Rome's low-lying ground, the valley between the hills, was a swamp. Waterlogged and malarial, it was essentially useless. Every time it rained heavily, the area flooded. For a city that was growing and needed space, this was a fundamental obstacle. Tarquinius began the project of draining it. What eventually grew from that effort became one of the most famous engineering achievements of the ancient world: the Cloaca Maxima, literally, the Great Drain, a massive underground sewage and drainage channel that the Romans would expand and rebuild for centuries. Some sections of it still exist beneath modern Rome. You can still see parts of its original outlet where it empties into the Tiber. The drained land became the Roman Forum. Think about that for a moment. The Roman Forum. The place where senators would debate the fate of empires, where generals would receive their triumphs, where the political life of Western civilization was conducted for centuries, was built on what had once been a swamp. And it was an Etruscan king who first drained it. Tarquinius also initiated construction on the Circus Maximus and began planning the great temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, a project that would outlast him. He introduced public games that served the same purpose everywhere in the ancient world, reminding people who was in charge while keeping them entertained. Rome was no longer just surviving. It was starting to look like a capital. But Tarquinius's dynasty was only just beginning. As the king aged and questions about succession hung in the air, a strange figure emerged from the shadows of the royal household. His origins were murky, his rise was even stranger, and the Romans who came after him would remember him as perhaps the greatest king Rome ever had. His name was Servius Tullius, and that story, how a man of uncertain origin became Rome's most celebrated ruler, is exactly where we're headed in the next episode.